but I have a $64,000 question for everyone, which I might answer at the end of the question period. I'm not going to answer it now. I want to give you time to think. How did the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz finally know he had a brain? Don't blurt it out. Just think for a moment. All righty. I guess I can introduce myself. I'm Karl Walling. I'm an alum from 1984. And I served in the military before I came to St. John's and afterwards. And without quite intending it, I've wound up teaching about war and peace ever since at various institutions. And that's one of the reasons for the title of my talk today on Thucydides on peace, peacemaking, and peacemakers. We study Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, but the question is, why didn't they make peace? Could they have made peace? What might we learn from this war about the problems of peace and peacemaking? Now, I violated all rules of PowerPoint. PowerPoint's very important in the Department of Defense. You don't do anything without a PowerPoint briefing. If the Chinese wanted to disable the American military, they'd put a worm in PowerPoint and we'd come to a grinding halt. But I did violate rules. My slides are too wordy. My one slide is too wordy. And what I've done is I prepared a handout because I know from the far back you can't read anything. So I'm going to talk about peace and peacemaking today, but I want to do so by being a Johnny, following my Megas Daimon, my Johnny conscience, and paying close attention to at least one sentence from the text, which I will claim is Thucydides' primary thesis for his entire book. Namely that the absence of romance in his history, let's stop there, no romance. What's he talking about? Well, he's just talked about in the previous 22 paragraphs about the history of Greece from the period of Homer to the present, his time in the 5th century. And I think he's saying I'm not Homer. By that I mean there's no Helen in his book. Indeed, women play very little role in his account. You usually hear about them after their husbands and fathers have been executed and they are sold into slavery along with their children. Or when statesmen like Pericles tell the women to shut up and stop crying and have more babies so that they can become Athenian soldiers. So no romance. But at a larger level, I think what he means is there will be no divine intervention in the way that there is in Homer's account. Thucydides will present a naturalistic account of the events of the Peloponnesian War. Religion plays a role in that war, especially in people's minds, and it can sometimes lead to fanaticism, as in the trial of Alcibiades. But Thucydides, the gods don't intervene. What happens in war is an entirely human affair. He says, so, absence of romance in my history. I'm going to stop right there. I'm not a classical historian, but I have many friends who are. And they tell me that whenever you see the word history in translations, you should grab your wallet. That most of the time the translators are inserting that word into the text, which sort of goes against a Johnny conscience. I looked at the lobe, and what it says in the lobe, at least, is narrative. And why does that matter? Because you might ask yourself, is Thucydides an historian? You might ask yourself, what is the role of history in his project? You may remember Aristotle in the Poetics telling you that literature is more philosophical than history because it tries to deal with universals, whereas history is very particular. And the question becomes, is that what Thucydides up to? Focusing just on the particular? He says, well, the absence of romance will, I fear, detract somewhat from his project's interest, i.e., sorry, I'm not sexy. I don't mean to be sexy. But he goes on to say, if it be judged useful, you might ask yourself, useful for what? All right, useful for what? Are we to pretend that he's the American philosopher George Santayana, who says those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it? Is that what Thucydides is up to? I think not. This is meant to be a guide to understanding. But note what he's saying. Through an exact knowledge of the past, that means he's going to do historical work in all conventional senses of the meaning of history. But he says, as an aid to understanding the future. Well, that's interesting. He thinks that if we get exact knowledge of the past, it will be an aid to understanding the future. The book is meant to be useful for understanding. Whether it is useful for practice, what you ought to do in your own time and situation, is an open question. At any rate, he is focusing on understanding, past, present, and future, which in the course of human things, by the way, that's usually translated in the course of human nature. And why does that matter? Because all wars are different. If the past is to help us understand the present and the future, you need a constant. And for Thucydides, the constant is human nature. He says, which in the course of human things must resemble if it does not reflect the past. I shall be content. In fine, I have written my work not as an essay, which is to win the applause of the moment. In other words, he doesn't care how many likes he gets on Facebook, but as a possession for all time. Now, possession for all time suggests to me that Thucydides is hunting much bigger game than an exact account of what happened in the Peloponnesian War. He's looking for something timeless, something universal. And in that sense, his work begins to approach something like philosophy, at least in terms of describing what happens in war, explaining its causes, and making predictions about the future. Now, that is my way of saying that Thucydides is the founder of many things, and one of them is what's sometimes called the historical case study report approach, where you start with the micro, something small, but what you're looking for is the macro, something big. Thucydides sees the Peloponnesian War as a microcosm of all war and all the problems that occur in war, including the problem of making peace, an understudied dimension of his account of the Peloponnesian War that may help us understand the problems of making peace past, present, and future. Please note, there are very few prescriptions about what we ought to do in Thucydides. The timeless things, the A-Day, if you wish, that Thucydides is interested in are primarily questions and problems. Why? Because war is very much the realm of the contingent. The answers in one war are often exactly the wrong answers in another war. So what he's trying to get you to focus on is the fundamental problems and questions. Now you might ask yourself, what good is that? Well, I mentioned the historical case study approach. It's invented, I would argue, in Thucydides' time in Greek medicine. And Thucydides borrows quite a bit from Greek medicine as he talks about the war, where you diagnose a problem, explain its causes, and make prognoses about it. This case study method is used today in all sorts of disciplines. Business schools use it. Medical schools use it. My home institution, the Naval War College, uses it. We treat the Peloponnesian War as the mother of all case studies. And then we develop all sorts of other case studies, some of which I've written myself. From Thucydides' account of the micro in this war, I'm going to suggest that there are three fundamental problems of making peace that you ignore at your peril. The first is, how far do you go militarily? That's a Goldilocks problem. You can go too far, like Napoleon in Russia. You can stop short. You can also, the next question would be, what do you ask for at the peace table? You can also ask too little, and then your opponent may take advantage of that. You can also ask for too much, so much so that your opponent says, that costs too much, and they walk away, and a war continues. And the third question would be, who enforces the peace and how? Peace is not self-enforcing. If you don't have a plan to enforce the peace is likely to be very fragile. And if you can't come up with something effective, making peace could be irrational. It could be something that leads to future conflict, perhaps on worse terms for you. So you have to think about that when you're trying to make peace. How are we going to enforce it? Now, what I'm going to do is say there are at least 7 mini cases of efforts to make peace in the Peloponnesian War. There's actually more, but I just want to focus on these 7. And if you look at these cases in light of those 3 questions, some of the generic problems of making peace may come to your attention. Now you might say, well, what good is that? And my answer is, if you're trying to make peace and you don't have an answer to those 3 questions, you're in a world of trouble. All right? You are in a world of trouble. So looking at the questions might help you in your own time. Not by giving you answers. Not by giving you answers, but by telling you what you have to pay attention to. All right, I'm going to talk about 7 failed efforts to make peace in this war. The first one occurs in what's called the Pentacontaitia, which is in Book 1, in which Thucydides trying to prove a different thesis, that the truest cause of the war was Sparta's fear of the growing power of Athens, tells the story of Greece from the end of the Persian Wars to the outbreak of the Second Peloponnesian War. At this point, some light bulbs should go off. Thucydides' primary subject is the Second Peloponnesian War. How many of you knew there was a first? All right. Well, it matters, all right? It matters greatly. You can't really understand the second one without paying attention to the first, and that's Thucydides' claim. So let's talk about the first for a moment. At the end of the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta have inflicted numerous defeats on Persia while fighting as allies. At Thermopylae, yeah, they lost, but they slowed the Persians down. Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, and elsewhere. The moment of victory is also the moment when their alliance is about to crumble, because they become suspicious of each other. The Athenians had developed wooden walls, that is to say, ships to protect Athens, and had risen from being a minor power in Greece to the greatest naval power in Greece. This worried the Spartans from the very beginning, and it worried many Greeks as well. But to protect themselves against the Persians coming back, they needed an alliance, they needed a navy, they needed a leader, and that turns out to be Athens. The Spartans, worried about the growth of Athenian power, come up with one of the first recorded arms control proposals. They say, hey, look, all of Greece is in ruins because of the Persians. Our walls are all torn down. I got an idea. Let's just make an agreement that we'll never build walls around our cities. That sounds fair. It applies to everyone, right? But Sparta has the biggest, baddest army in all of Greece. Who does this arms control proposal favor? The Athenians can see right through it. This isn't a strategy for peace through arms control. This is a strategy to preserve Sparta's dominance of Greece. As a result, their leader, Themistocles, is sent to Sparta as an ambassador. And the Spartans kind of like him. He's a hero. But every once in a while they say, you guys aren't building any walls, are you? No, we'd never build walls. No. We don't build walls. Meanwhile, he's sending letters back to Athens saying, build walls fast. And they build walls. And they're not any kind of walls. They're long walls, too, extending from the city of Athens down to its port, the Piraeus. Why? Because that means Athens can import food safely by sea. That in effect, it becomes an island, invulnerable to attack by Sparta, and able to project power through its navy. Eventually, once the walls are built, Themistocles says to the Spartans, do you know who you're talking to here? You're talking to me. You're talking to Athens. From now on, you will treat us as equals and give us the respect we deserve. Well, this kind of scares the Spartans. And secretly, they incite an Athenian ally. Let me say something about alliances here. In blue, we have the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, a land power. I'm colorblind. What color is that? In red, looks pink to me. In red, we have the Delian League, led by Athens, a sea power. Sparta incites one of Athens' allies, Thasos, to rebel. Why rebel? Because the Delian League began as a voluntary alliance, but over time, the Athenians transformed it into a tribute-paying empire. All those islands out there had to pay tribute to Athens. And if you go to Athens and visit the Parthenon, realize that that was paid for by tribute from Athenian allies who see themselves as quasi-slaves to Athens. And that's one of the paradoxes of the war, that Athens might have been the freest city in Greece at home, but acts like a tyrannical empire abroad. Well, the Spartans get Thasos to rebel, and they promise, if you rebel, we will invade Attica, the farmland around Athens. What happens, however, is there's an earthquake in Sparta. And the earthquake supplies an opportunity for the slaves in Sparta, the helots, who constitute 90% of its population, to rebel. Technically, Athens and Sparta are still allies, even though Sparta is secretly planning to stab Athens in the back. The Athenians show up with an army to help out the Spartans put down the slave rebellion. The Spartans say, what if the Athenians team up with the slaves? And they say, thanks, but no thanks. We got this one, all right? We don't need your help. And they send the Athenians home. En route, the Athenians learn that Sparta was planning to incite that revolution, that revolt, and invade Attica, and the First Peloponnesian War begins. Now, by the way, I had a laser pointer, but it doesn't work on this reflective glass, so I got a point. At the beginning of the war, the Athenians are expanding in all directions. This city here, Megara on the isthmus, is kind of the boardwalk of the Monopoly game here. Whoever controls it controls egress and entrance from Attica to the Peloponnese. Megara, at the start of the First Peloponnesian War, is an ally of Athens. The Athenians gain a foothold down here at a place called Troezen. Why does that matter? Because it's close to Argos, Sparta's traditional enemy on land. Through Troezen, they have a base by which they might link up their forces with the Spartans. And they gain control of Achaia. And that matters because Sparta's most important ally is Corinth. If they control that, Corinth, a trading city, cannot trade. And so they could put pressure on Corinth to desert the Spartans. So far, the Athenians are doing well. But one thing one notes about the Athenians in Thucydides is they have no self-control, no restraint. Somebody comes up with a great idea. There's a rebellion in Egypt, which is not on my map, and there's a reason. Because Egypt's a long, long way away. And Egypt is part of the Persian Empire. In going after Egypt, the Athenians are picking a war with the Persian Empire while fighting Sparta. Maybe a bridge or two too far. The result is the Athenian fleets, they send two, are destroyed in the Nile. The Egyptians drained the water and they get stuck in the mud. At the same time, the Athenians suffer a major defeat at a place called Tanagra on land here because they were fighting outside the walls. Hint, why build walls if you're going to fight outside them against the best army in Greece? It didn't make sense. What's the result? Major military reversal for the Athenians. The Athenians went too far militarily. They got overextended. They suffered a major reversal, and now they have to ask for peace. The Spartans say, you want peace? Let me tell you what you're going to pay. Give us back Troezen. Oh, by the way, except that Megara is now our ally. They create, they get a revolution in Megara, and it flips to Sparta's side. Meaning Sparta can invade Attica by land whenever it wants and get out of Achaia. That's to please Sparta's ally, Corinth. So the Athenians, because of this self-inflicted wound, have to agree to terms that enable Sparta to win the First Peloponnesian War. How are you going to enforce this thing? We don't have copies of the treaty, but there's evidence that two things were crucial, or three things. First, there's a rough balance of power. Peace enforcement and rough balances of power go together like ham and eggs. Usually, they depend on each other. Secondly, they agree that henceforward, nobody's going to try to steal anybody's allies. What's blue here remains blue, and what's red or pink remains red. And last, they say, if we have a quarrel, we'll go to arbitration. We'll go to the oracle at Delphi, who takes bribes. We'll go to the oracle at Delphi, and he'll act like the world court, and we'll settle everything peacefully. Now, this is something innovative in my talk today. Usually, in talking about Book 1, people stress Thucydides' account of the origins of the war, and they're not wrong to do so. So let me talk about the origins of the war and then add a different layer to thinking about it. Up here is a city called Epidamnus that has a civil war. It's a colony of Corcyra. The losing faction in Epidamnus goes to Corcyra and say, Mom, I'm having a trouble with my brother, help me out. Mom says, go away, you bother me. You kids settle this amongst yourselves. But Corcyra is a colony of Corinth. And the losing faction in Epidamnus goes to Corinth, if you wish, Grandma, and says, Grandma, Mom won't help me. And Grandma is really angry at Mom and decides to intervene to help Epidamnus. Mom says, stop messing around with my family, get out of here. Corcyra and Corinth, an ally of Sparta, go to war. Corcyra wins, but is worried that it might not be able to defeat Corinth in the long run. They send ambassadors to Athens and say, will you be my ally? Promise to love you to the end of time. And the Athenians say, well, you don't want to pick a war with Corinth. And they say, oh, by the way, we'll increase your naval power by 33%. The Athenians have 100 ships, the Corcyraeans 100. And the Athenians say, well, that'd be nice. And they say, oh, by the way, look at the map. We're on the route to Sicily. That's important. It means the Athenians were thinking about going to Sicily even before the Second Peloponnesian War began. The Athenians make a defensive alliance with Corcyra. Corinth comes to attack Corcyra. The Athenians get dragged into it. Now it looks like a classic story of a spiral of escalation in which a little war in a tiny place drags in all the great powers, because now the Corinthians say to Sparta, you got to help us out. And that would mean war against Athens. That's the standard way of telling this story. I'm going to do something unstandard. I'm going to talk about the breakdown of the peace. It's the same thing as the origins of the war, but told from a different perspective of how what's called the 30-year peace that ended the First Peloponnesian War broke down. But note, the Greek word here is sponde, which means truce, even though most translations say peace. I submit there's a difference between a truce and a peace. And you know what the difference is. A truce is temporary. It says 30 years. We're taking a timeout, folks, for 30 years. Those are the terms. That should tell you something about the instability of so-called peace settlements in ancient Greece. People are taking time outs. Here's proof from Herodotus. In peace, he says, sons bury their fathers. In war, fathers bury their sons. Now, sons cannot replace their fathers, but fathers can replace their sons. How? By having more babies. Well, they grow up. In about 15, they're old enough to fight. It matters that the Second Peloponnesian War breaks out 15 years after the end of the First Peloponnesian War. This was not meant to be a permanent peace. It was a truce. And even then, what one sees is something devious on the part of the Athenian statesman Pericles, who I would say is trying to get the fruits of military victory without fighting. The treaty said, don't poach on each other's allies. Corcyra was neutral. Making the alliance with Corcyra did not violate the letter of the terms. But the spirit is different. The spirit is you stay in your zone and we will stay in our own. Thucydides says the truest cause of the war is the growth of Athenian power. Corcyra increases Athenian naval power by 33% and scares both Sparta and its ally Corinth. And over here is Megara. Megara had flipped to the Spartan side. The Athenians want Megara back, but they don't want to go to war for it. Solution, economic sanctions. We will forbid Megara to trade anywhere with the Delian League. Well, the result is, and you see this in Aristophanes, by the way, the people of Megara start to starve. Sparta can see a pattern here, that the Athenians are trying to flip powers to their side without actually going to war. As a result, they say, we got to check Athens before it's too late to check Athens. They really don't mean to abide by the spirit of the treaty. And the Second Peloponnesian War breaks out because of Pericles' efforts to evade the way in which the peace was meant to be enforced. All right, the war breaks out. I'm going to talk about a second failure to make peace. Neither Sparta nor Athens make much headway against each other. And you might ask yourself, why? Athens is a sea power, if you wish, a shark. Sparta is a land power, if you wish, a tiger. How does a tiger fight a shark? Excuse me? They're in different, they're kings of different domains, right? Well, that's the fundamental strategic problem of the war. The tiger has to find a way to swim or get an ally who can swim, and the shark has to find a way to walk on land or get an ally who can walk on land, and that is very difficult, especially when the stakes are as high as they are in this war. Namely, if you lose, you will suffer the dominion of the other. So the war drags on because neither side can get good leverage over the other. And along comes the plague in Athens. The Athenians, it is estimated, lost a third of their population to the plague. They're suffering. And they're all crowded inside the city walls. Imagine that COVID comes along and we're all crammed inside of a football stadium, watching each other die. Well, that's what Athens is like at that moment. Massive death, everyone can see it. They're in a world of pain. So the Athenians send ambassadors to Sparta and say, can we have peace? The Spartan army is ravaging Attica, ripping up the farms. not going anywhere near the city. We don't want no COVID, all right? We don't want COVID. And the Spartans say, well, peace. Our stated war aim is that you guys give up your empire. But if the Athenians give up their empire, they can't fund their navy, and they can't feed themselves. And they will be starved and at Sparta's mercy. And the Athenians say, oh, we want peace, but we don't want to commit suicide. And basically, the Spartans are saying suicide or peace. Pericles convinces the Athenians that peace is not worth suicide, and they continue fighting. He also promises them something important, however, that they can have immortal fame because with their navy, they can dominate the entire Mediterranean world. They can turn the Mediterranean into an Athenian-dominated lake in the same way that Rome would later do. So the Athenians continue to fight, in part because Sparta's demands were too much. The war drags on and on and on. It becomes a stalemate, like World War I, if you wish. And the question becomes, how do you break a stalemate? The Athenians are the first to innovate down here at a place called Pylos. This is where most of Sparta's slaves live. They send a garrison to Pylos to build a fort. Why build a fort there? Because rebellions, revolutions, insurgencies do best when there's a sanctuary that the insurgents can retreat to. This scares the Spartans, and they send forces by sea and land, and one of the forces, a detachment, is on the island of Sphacteria in the harbor of Pylos, and the Athenians capture it. Now, the members of that detachment were sons of the most important and influential Spartans. It's sort of like they have the Spartan gene pool in their hands. At this point, it's the Spartans who sue for peace. Indeed, they promise the Athenians, look, we'll make peace. You and I will share the rule of Greece together. For 50 years, by the way. The longer people propose a treaty in Thucydides, the shorter the peace is likely to last. It's just one of those comic ironies of the book. So the Spartans propose peace. Now it's the Athenians' turn to demand too much. The Athenian demagogic statesman Cleon says, you want peace? Let's talk peace. We want Trojan back. We want the ports of Megara so that they can import nothing and we can starve them and they'll flip back to our side. And we want Achaia. In other words, you want peace? Reverse the terms that settled the first Peloponnesian War. And Cleon, who's very ambitious, knows that Pericles lost those territories in the first Peloponnesian War. And if he gains them back, he will be remembered as a greater statesman than Pericles. But if Sparta gives up Trojan, the Athenians can link up with Argos. They got a slave rebellion here. What if Argos and Athens attack this way and the Spartans have to deal with a slave rebellion? If Sparta gives up Megara, it's cut off from its most important ally, Thebes. If Sparta gives up Achaia, Corinth might well desert Sparta. In other words, the Athenians are saying, you can have peace. Please commit suicide. And the Spartans say, well, we want peace, but we're not going to commit suicide for it. And so the war drags on and on and on. Those of you who know Aristophanes, Lysistrata, war weariness amongst the belligerents. Well, the Spartans are down, really, really down. What are they going to do? Their best hope is to incite rebellions amongst Athens' ally. But they had almost no navy at the start of the war. Oh, and part of the terms for a truce at Pylos is they had to give the Athenians their navy for safekeeping. And the Athenians said, oh, don't worry about it. After the truce is over, we'll give you your navies back. Scouts honor. Scouts honor. The Athenians come up with a pretext, and they've taken all of Sparta's navy. What can Sparta do? Answer. They have a brilliant, innovative leader, a guy named Brasidas, who says, we'll go by land. Up here, through Thessaly and Macedonia, and we'll get to this region here, Chalcidice, where he incites one rebellion after another. The most important of the rebellions was at this town here, Amphipolis. The Athenians are now scared. Our empire is falling apart. Maybe we should have made peace earlier. They start to say that. Maybe we should have made peace earlier. Maybe we should have compromised with the Spartans. But it's too late now. The tides of the war are turning. And the Athenians suffer a major defeat at the hands of Sparta's ally Thebes at Delium. So the chips are down for the Athenians now. But the Spartans still want their prisoners back. They want that slave rebellion to end. At this point, each side is saying, we don't want to go any further militarily. They're exhausted and scared. Sparta, by the way, is scared that a treaty with Argos will expire in a year. Those expiration dates on treaties matter. They decide to make peace with Athens so that they can get ready for war with Argos. So Sparta, Athens, each side has decided it's time to stop further military advances. Each side also compromises. Each side says, well, maybe it's unreasonable to demand that our opponent commit suicide for the sake of peace. The Athenians lower their demands. They just want the status quo ante. Let's go back to the way things were before the war started. By the way, that means give us back everything we lost up here. Sparta says, well, we want our prisoners back. They're no longer saying, give up your empire. We want our prisoners back, and would you please leave Pylos? Note, the political demands are now commensurate with the military leverage each side has over the other. And that very much enables peace terms. This leads to what we call the Peace of Nicias, which falls apart largely because you don't have an effective way to enforce it. They draw straws. Sparta gets the longer one. Athens gives the prisoners back. Sparta is supposed to give Athens these cities, but above all, Amphipolis back. But the Spartans say to the Athenians, we want to give it back to you, but the people of Amphipolis don't want us to trade them back to you. And there's a reason. The Athenians occasionally kill all the men and sell the women and children of defeated rebel cities into slavery. Pretend you're the mayor of Amphipolis, and I'm a Spartan general. Sir, we just made peace with Amphipolis. Here's the deal. You have to go back to the Athenian alliance. What do you say to me?
Anything to stay with you.
Yeah, well, you can think of the four-letter words, all right? You can just think of them. What does that mean? The peace terms were unenforceable. Sparta could not return Amphipolis. because the people of Amphipolis refuse to be returned because they know the Spartans, the Athenians, will kill them. And they'd rather live. So what's the result? Sparta can't return Amphipolis. The Athenians refuse to evacuate Pylos. Thucydides calls this a treacherous armistice, not a true peace. And by the way, it was supposed to last 50 years. Now we know that the longer they promise to make peace, the sooner the next war comes. And that's what happens. Sparta's alliance collapses, but it puts it back together again. About 7 years into the peace, Athens teams up with Argos for the largest land battle of the war during the peace. All right? There's something comic about this book at times. The largest land battle occurs during the so-called Peace of Nicias, which fell apart because you couldn't enforce it. All right, that brings me to the Melian Dialogue, arguably the most famous part of the book. Here's the story. During the so-called peace, Athens sends a fleet to Melos, which is neutral and a colony of Sparta, but tried to stay out of the war. How many of you are Star Trek fans? The Athenian message to the Melians is join the Borg. All right, join the empire or else. The Melians ask for a conference and say, well, we really don't want to be a part of your empire. And we think we have better odds than you do because we're kin of the Spartans and Sparta will intervene to help us out. Even though Sparta doesn't have a navy. And they say, and by the way, you guys are bad people and we are good people. Anybody here ever go to Sunday school? Did you learn in Sunday school that God protects good people from bad people? You were told that. Well, the Melians actually believe this, that the gods will be on their side. But I told you, there's no romance in this book. There's no divine intervention. Finally, they say, it would be dishonorable for us to surrender to you, even though all these other islands have surrendered. Note what it means. You pay tribute to the Athenians once per year. All right, I want you to think about it. I want you to pretend that you own a grocery store in Brooklyn. All right? And I happen to work for an organization. And I come into your shop, and by the way, your family lives above the shop. And I say, it would be a shame if there were a fire here. Do you smell smoke? Tell you what, I sell insurance. If you give me 10% every year, I guarantee there will be no fire. What do you think? Would you give me my 10%?
Doesn't seem like there's another option, is there?
Do you feel like an abject slave? I mean, it's regrettable. But those are the Athenian terms. The Melians, however, say this is abject slavery, dishonorable. We cannot give in. Well, the result is the Athenians overwhelm them. There's a siege, there's a traitor, they get inside the walls, they conquer Melos. The Athenians also come up with an interesting peace enforcement strategy. They kill all the men, and they sell the women and children into slavery, and then they colonize Melos. That's one way to make peace. All right, just obliterate your adversary. However, I'm going to suggest that this was a strategic mistake on the part of the Athenians. Also not on my map, way over here is Sicily. Thucydides places his account of the Melian Dialogue just before the Athenian expedition to Sicily. Why? All right, you, sir, I want you to pretend that you're the mayor of Syracuse, Athens' most formidable opponent in Sicily. You get a tweet, and it says, the Athenians massacred all the men on Melos, and the women and children have been sold and dispersed throughout the Mediterranean. Our word genocide, by the way, comes from that Greek word genos for race. Genocide at Melos. The race of Melians is extinct. You know what happened to Melos. When the Athenians come, are you going to surrender? Would you surrender to them, knowing what they've done at Melos? I think it's really important. They overwhelmed these folks, but in Syracuse, you ain't doing to me what you did there. And Syracuse ultimately takes the Athenians down. They lose half their navy and army in Sicily, in part because of their will to fight. So you can say what happens at Melos boomerangs on the Athenians. Now, two more peace settlements and I'll come to a close. After the defeat in Sicily, Athens is in a really bad situation. Sparta has occupied Attica, so they get no food. Athenian allies start to rebel. And Persia intervenes in this wars, following the advice of a serial traitor, Alcibiades, who tells the Persians, use Sparta to wear out Athens, and Athens to wear out Sparta. And once they're both exhausted, you can walk in and clean house. Despite all that, the Athenians are resilient and able to persevere another 10 years in this war, even though there's revolution and counter-revolution inside of Athens. It's very hard to fight a war when you're in the middle of a revolution. All that is happening. In the 26th year of the war, the Athenian fleet faces off against the Persian subsidized Spartan fleet. 180 ships or so on both sides. The Athenians crush the Spartans, totally devastate them. The Spartans say, you want to talk? Let's talk peace. But the Athenians, this is amazing. I told you, they don't have much restraint, self-control. The Athenians blow them off. Sorry, we're not talking peace. We're going to rebuild our empire to its former greatness. We are going to crush all these rebellions, and by the way, you're next. No peace. A year later, Sparta, under a new admiral, Lysander, surprises the Athenian fleet at Aegis Potami. He burns it on the beach. Very important. The Athenian navy is destroyed on land, not at sea. It's burned to the ground. Athens imports much of its food through the Hellespont. It ain't coming that way. And the Spartans are besieging Attica this way. Athens is starved into surrender. At which point you have to think about peace. Sparta's ally Thebes advised the Spartans, do to the Athenians what the Athenians did to Melos. Kill all the men. Sell the women and children into slavery. Had Sparta done so, Socrates would have been killed, Euripides, Plato, end of the Greek Enlightenment. But Sparta spares the Athenians, not out of love of literature, philosophy, and culture, but because it's worried about a power vacuum. If we destroy Athens, who's our next challenger? And they look at their ally Thebes and says, Thebes is the next one coming against us. So they say to the Athenians, tear down your walls, get rid of your empire, and by the way, that democracy thing, it's over. You're going to take 30 tyrants from us. Looks like a fairly effective peace enforcement strategy. Problem, the character of the Athenians. Within a couple years, the Athenians overthrow the Spartan-installed puppet regime. And it's back to dealing with the Athenian democracy. But the Athenians no longer have an empire. No longer have an empire. They are no longer a great power. Thebes goes to war with Sparta, which has been exhausted by the war. Its population is way down. Thebes defeats Sparta, which also becomes a second-rate power. This was not only predictable, the predictable end to the Peloponnesian War, it was predicted by the Spartan king Archidamus in Book 1 of Thucydides' account, who said, I fear this is a war we will bequeath to our children, who said there's no way anyone can gain from this war. But the Spartans overruled him, and the Peloponnesian War, Second Peloponnesian War, began. Now, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, everyone's thinking that Persia will come in and clean house. But the Persians have a civil war. They're out of the action. Thebes does defeat Sparta, but Thebes itself had been exhausted by the Peloponnesian War. But up here in the north, in Macedon, they got great cavalry up there. Under Philip, they invade and conquer all of Greece. And under Alexander, Philip's son, they conquer the world. What does that mean? The polis, the Greek city-state, is extinct. It is as dead as a dinosaur. The Greeks do not recover anything like their previous freedom until the 19th century. Now, why does that matter? If this outcome was not only predictable, but predicted, they should have made peace earlier, a lot earlier. Hegel is famous for saying that the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk. That's German for hindsight's 2020. Looking back, when you see a war of mutual exhaustion, where only outside powers can benefit, you want to make peace earlier, not later. But the Athenians and the Spartans couldn't. And the question is why? One answer is they didn't have good answers to these three questions, which is why, shifting from the micro to the macro, from the particular to the general, if not universal, when you're thinking about war, you have to think about how you're going to end it, and therefore you have to think about those three questions. Or, if you follow Shakespeare's Mark Antony and cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war, those dogs have a will of their own, and the war may go in directions you do not want. All right, that's enough. There are other things I might say, but we'll address what we can in the question period. I need to point out that I'm double booked today. At 6 o'clock, I have to go give a different lecture at the Naval Academy. So promptly at 5:30, I'm going to stop so I can get over there. However, I'm a Johnny, and I can talk about books till dawn, especially this one. At about 8:30, I'll be back on campus in, what do they call the basement of McDowell now? You can't call it the coffee shop anymore. I'll be in the basement of McDowell at about 8:30, so if you have further questions, you can catch me there. All right. Questions? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you think there's any difference between the military strategy or peacemaking strategy between the Spartans and the Athenians, and sort of should I say it again? Did you hear me?
Sure. This is going to be recorded, so all my alumni friends can hear it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, no pressure to me, I guess. I'm wondering if you think there's any military strategy differences between Sparta and Athens, like if they behave differently at all, or if it's just sort of like the human things and they're the same. And sort of along with that, I'm wondering if there are differences, if like the political structure of Sparta versus Athens would have to do with that. Does the question make sense?
Oh, some people have talked about it a little bit. They're fabulous questions, all right? Those are really, really good. I just wish the officers I teach would come up with questions that good. I'm going to put your question in my own terms. How much of this is due to human nature? How much is due to the cultures of the different regimes? And you might even say, you know, what might this war reveal about democratic culture in war? I've given that lecture. It lasts about an hour. So I'm going to try to be brief. Human nature. Thucydides sees the ultimate causes of the Athenian Empire which provoked the war, and therefore you could say the ultimate causes of war in three passions: fear, honor, and the desire for gain. However, those passions might have different weights and intensities in different kinds of regimes and at different times and places in a struggle. Spartan culture matters in this war, so does Athenian. You all know the story of the tortoise and the hare. Let me suggest to you that Athens is the hare. It's much faster than Sparta. Had it not made serious mistakes, it should have won this war. But it self-destructs, most notably in Sicily, but I would say earlier after their victories at Pylos, when they could have made peace on far better terms than what they got at the end of the war. And the same is true after the Battle of Arginusae. And, you know, in the great debate in Sparta in Book 1 about going to war, the Corinthians say of the Athenians, they can take no rest themselves, nor give it to others. That's Greek for being a royal pain, all right? They just can't stop. And you see that, you know, when they went to Egypt. The Spartans are different. The Spartan regime is designed to encourage discipline. The Scottish philosopher David Hume once said that Sparta was an army disguised as a city or a city-state. Discipline matters in Sparta. Why do they have so much? In part because of those slaves. All right, when 90% of the population is slaves, you better have a really good army. All right, you better have a really good army. And by the way, the converse is also true. The slaves do all the work so that the Spartan army can do one-arm push-ups all the time. Fear of a slave rebellion is extremely important in Spartan strategic behavior. whenever Sparta goes to war, it risks a two-front war against whoever they're fighting and slaves. And that's how Sparta is ultimately brought to its knees by Thebes. It teamed up with Argos for a conventional conflict, and it used the slaves for an unconventional one, and it was just too much for Sparta to handle. This all influences Sparta's strategic behavior. Sparta doesn't like to see its army far from home because, well, you know, the slaves might rebel. And by the way, Sparta has not one but two kings. In effect, you have commander-in-chief abroad and commander-in-chief at home. The Spartans' strategic behavior is also different from that of the Athenians. By the way, when I say strategic behavior, that's a term of art. People use that term all the time in talking about strategy today. Sparta's strategic behavior is also different because when they invade Attica, which they do every year for the first 10 years of the war, they don't stay. They stick, they burn, and then they go home. Why? Got to take care of those slaves. And also, Sparta's poor. It's poor because its founder, Lycurgus, banned gold and silver. Why did he ban gold and silver currency? Because he said, the bane of all Greek cities is civil war. The source of civil war is class conflict. We'll get rid of class conflict in Sparta by getting rid of gold and silver. So the Spartans have a currency that's made out of iron, and it's really heavy. Imagine going to the grocery store. You're carrying this iron goblet. Dozen eggs, please. Nobody in Greece wants Spartan currency. Sparta can't trade. Sparta has limited money. It matters economically in this war. Because of the slaves, the Spartans have incredible staying power. But because they have no money, they're not good at projecting power abroad. The only way they're going to win this war if a rich sugar daddy comes along. And that rich sugar daddy is Persia, that subsidizes the Spartans. Now, the Persians were terrified of going to war against Athens. They don't intervene until very late in this war. When? After the Athenians are defeated in Sicily. That is to say, Athenian overextension in Sicily triggers the foreign intervention that enables the Spartans to transform themselves from a land into a sea power, from a tiger into a shark, and defeat the Athenians decisively at sea. And, you know, I talked about strategic behavior here, or strategic culture. What you have here is partly the interaction of the strategic cultures, that the Athenian propensity to push too far, demand too much, triggered what enables Sparta, this slow-moving tortoise, to finally win the race. Other questions? Yes, sir, I got you too, but go ahead.
I was wondering if you believe the... Oh, sorry.
No, we got time. I was just making sure I was not going to be late to my next lecture.
I was wondering if you believed the thesis of Book 1 that war between an established and rising power is inevitable.
All right. I'm going to qualify what you said a little bit. You are talking about Book 1, paragraph 23, which is the paragraph after that one. Thucydides, in that paragraph, says, I will talk to you about the immediate causes of the war and the spoken ones, the things that made people really angry, the things that led to a spiral of escalation. But he says the truest cause of the war, often it's translated as real cause. That's not the Greek. The Greek word there is aletheia, for true, and it's in the perfectionist sense. The truest cause, which by the way means these other things were part of the cause, but not the most important. They were catalysts, if you wish. The truest cause was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this instilled in Sparta. But you use the word inevitable. It ain't in the Greek. Some translator got to be a busybody again. And you see what happens. Why does this matter? Well, about 10 years ago, a colleague of mine, Graham Allison, a sometimes colleague of mine, Graham Allison, a pioneering political scientist from the mid-60s to the present, who learned a lot of Greek in prep school and then went to Harvard and was part of Mr. Flamenhoff's generation of political scientists. About a decade ago, he wrote a book called The Thucydides Trap, in which he examined 16 cases of the structural situation of an established power dealing with a rising challenger. We get the first case here, Sparta trying to deal with Athens. And please note, there's push in both directions. Sparta doesn't want to give up its hegemony, and Athens is seeking it. But he looked at 15 other cases. And by the way, I began by talking about the case study approach. Graham Allison is really doing the same sort of thing that Thucydides did in his own time. In 12 out of those 16 cases, the situation led to war. 12 out of 16 is not inevitable. What I find most interesting in his book, which became celebrated throughout the national security establishment, especially with the issue of the United States dealing with the rise of China. What I find most interesting about the book is the 4 cases did not lead to war. Why did that happen? One of the cases he discusses, by the way, has to do with England dealing with not 1, but 3 rising challengers at the same time. England, the greatest naval power of the 19th century. But as that century comes to an end, there are 3 rising naval powers. Germany, Japan, and the United States of America. And the British, if they had to fight all 3, they'd be in a world of trouble. And they said, which one of these is most dangerous to us? And they said, well, the Germans. So they wanted to recall their fleet to home waters to be able to confront the German fleet. But they had possessions all over the world. How could they handle this? How many of you have ever heard someone say, appeasement is always wrong? Because if you give a mouse a cookie, what happens?
He'll ask for a glass of milk.
And where's that going to stop? All right? First they take Czechoslovakia, then it's Poland, and then you got World War II. So never appease anyone. The British, in order to deter Germany, wound up appeasing the United States and Japan. They said to the Japanese, you know what, if you protect our interests in the Far East, we'll protect your interests over here in Europe. And they said to the Americans, you know that Monroe Doctrine you guys have always been talking about, you know, that you don't want European empires recolonizing the Western Hemisphere. We really weren't on board with that when Monroe said it in 1823. But upon further reflection, it might not be a bad idea. We've been enforcing the Monroe Doctrine for you guys for a long time because you're too cheap to build your own navy. But if you build your own navy and protect our interests in the Western Hemisphere, we will withdraw our navy from the Western Hemisphere. And we really want to because we're scared of Germany. Now, I bring that back to something I said when I started, that the answers to perennial problems and questions of the sort that Thucydides brings up are contingent on circumstances. Sometimes appeasement is a good strategy. I'm married. I practice appeasement every day, all right? And most married people do in some form or another. Appeasement got a bad name after the French and the British betrayed Czechoslovakia at Munich before World War II. The problem with appeasement is not the strategy, but who you are trying to appease. Temporarily, the British could appease Japan. They could appease the United States. You could not appease Germany and the Nazis in 1938. So if you choose appeasement as a strategy, you better ask yourself, are these the kind of people I can buy off? If the answer is yes, then maybe you think about it. If the answer is no, then you rule it out. By the way, another way of thinking about appeasement has to do with civil suits, law. Sometimes you get sued. You go to your lawyer and you say, what do I do about this? And your lawyer says, well, how much are you willing to pay? And how much are you willing to risk? And he says, you could just settle this privately. That's appeasement. I'm not saying appeasement is always wrong. I'm saying whether you appease depends on who it is you are seeking to appease. All right. You, sir, you had a question.
I was just interested if you could say anything more about the Oracle of Delphi as a negotiating party between these two. You mentioned it being able to receive bribes, and I'm interested in that. I was just interested if you could speak about that in terms of the peacemaking between the two nations. And
Well,
what you know.
it may have something to do with Sparta's refusal to go to arbitration before the war. If you look at in Book 1, the Spartan king Archidamus says to the Spartan people, he's basically trying to slow down the rush to war. The Spartans have voted for war, and he says, hey, guys, slow down, we're not ready. He's saying mañana. Now, in my house, if my wife asks me something that I really don't want to do, I say, I'll get to it tomorrow. Tomorrow usually means never, mañana. My guess is that the Spartan king, fearing that the war would lead to the mutual exhaustion of Athens and Greece, did not want to go to war. But he disguises it as an effort to slow down the rush to war. And he says, by the way, the treaty requires us to go to arbitration. We should try arbitration first before we go to war. He's overruled because others in Sparta say, we don't have time for that. The longer we wait, the stronger Athens will get. We have to get Athens before Athens gets us. but he was willing to go to arbitration. And I'll tell you what probably would have happened. The Spartans would have lost. And it's not simply because they're poor and the Athenians are rich, and therefore the Athenians could offer better bribes. It's because technically the Athenians hadn't broken the 30-year truce. They were completely entitled, according to the letter of the treaty, to make the alliance with Corcyra. And the treaty said, you know, you're not going to go to war to flip allies like Megara. It didn't say anything about economic sanctions. So the Spartans were probably going to lose. And that comes back to what I said about Pericles, that he's trying to achieve the fruits of military victory without war. After all, if Athens is getting stronger and stronger every day, then it makes sense to delay war with Sparta as long as possible. But at the same time, he's an Athenian and he has a hard time with restraint. And so he wants to push the envelope to see what he can get through peaceful means. Now there's a second place in Book 1 where arbitration comes up, and it's at the end of Pericles' first speech. He's basically saying to the Athenians, if you do the appropriate calculation, there's no way we are going to lose this war with Sparta unless we self-destruct. And of course, we're not going to self-destruct. Unless you do something stupid, like invade Egypt / Sicily again, we'll win. Unless you do something stupid, like fight out Spartans outside the walls of Athens, we are going to win. And the treaty says they're supposed to go to arbitration. Why is arbitration so important for Pericles? Because public opinion matters, especially in democracy. It really helps when you go to war to think your cause is just. He's not going to start the war. He's going to let the Spartans start the war. And if the Spartans start the war without going to arbitration, they will have violated the treaty, and it will be easier for Pericles to unite the war as a war of self-defense, to unite the Athenian people in a war of self-defense. However, he's lying. All those speeches in Thucydides are full of lies, and Pericles is lying. How do I know? Because he's already violating the spirit by making the alliance with Corcyra and trying to flip Megara. But he's not the only one who lies. The Spartans know that their legal and moral grounds for going to war are weak. How do you justify going to war when your moral and legal cause is bankrupt? Make something up, all right? Make something up. And there's a series of Spartan demands where they say, Pericles' family, they did something rotten against the gods. You Athenians, get rid of Pericles because he's obviously a blasphemer and impious. He's got a curse. They say, cast out the curse of the god in Athens, which means get rid of Pericles. Pericles reads their note and he says, comes up with his own pretext and says, cast out your own curse, all right? But that's all part of their struggle to come up with ways to justify the war to themselves and their allies, and this matters. Sparta starts the war with a stated war aim. We are going to free the Greeks from the Athenian Empire. Yeah, I know we're breaking the treaty and we should have gone to arbitration, but we're going to free all Greece. Nothing wrong with that. Their stated war aim. Is that what they really wanted? Much dispute. The principal cause of Sparta entering the war is when its ally Corinth, which is angry because Sparta hasn't helped it out at Corcyra, says to the Spartans, look, if you don't do something about this, you're on your own. We're leaving. Honey, I'm packing up. Sparta can't deal without Corinth. It needs money and it needs ships, which Corinth has. So what is driving Sparta into this war, I suspect, is it sees that Pericles' strategy is causing friction within its entire alliance system. So it's going to war to save its alliance and disguising its purpose as a moral cause to make the world safe from Athenian democracy, all right? Not to make the world safe for democracy, but from it. And that's common in this book. When you read Thucydides, you always have to compare what the leaders say to what is actually going on in the war. Because you would be shocked to discover that they lie as much as our leaders today. This will be the last one because I got to take off. Go ahead.
Enjoyed this lecture, and then
Can you speak up a little bit?
I really enjoyed this lecture, and then I really like your analogy. It's like so good. But I'm wondering, like, in what degree this is predictable or analyzable, and or in what degree it is rely on miracle or something stupid choice. So, like, for example, the decision Melio made, and also the battle in the, what is it called? The battle in the Sicily is like something hard to expect. Like, we cannot say, yeah, like it's more sounds like miracle or sounds like stupid choice. And then I was told that the last chapter of War and Peace also alludes something like one simple incident become a cause of other effect. So there might be some like driving force throughout all the wars and peace. So yeah, so that's giving me question of whether it is all clearly predictable or there's something we cannot predict, and then we still need to rely on what we call miracle.
Wow, that's a really wonderful question. When I was at homecoming this year, we read the Bacchae, which I've read multiple times, and I've never gotten a grip on it. I've never been able to come to terms with whatever's going on in that tragedy. And we had a homecoming seminar, and none of us could really come to terms with it, get a grip on it. And it occurred to me after the seminar that maybe that's the point in the Bacchae, that you don't understand things well enough, and you certainly don't control things well enough to put us to make us really doubt our own power and wisdom, which might lead to a certain kind of humility. And that humility, in turn, might lead to a certain kind of restraint and moderation. At least I was playing with such ideas. Much in war is a matter of chance. There's a wonderful line in Thucydides where the Athenians talk about, we killed a bunch of Spartans, you're Spartans with arrows, and the Spartans say, well, arrows don't have a will of their own. They just land where they land. And so it's a matter of chance how folks can die. That's true. And I'm with you that far. However, I am a political scientist. I only tell that to my friends. It's so good to be out. I breathe easier now. Even though you can't get absolute laws in politics, there are too many variables, they're uncontrolled, and that's especially true in time of war. You're not going to get absolute laws. You can get probabilities. All right? Example, a war between a land power and a sea power is probably going to be pretty long because of the difficulty each side is going to have in finding a way to fight in its opponent's element. Example, if you have a struggle between two evenly matched opponents, outside intervention is often decisive. And that, by the way, is something that the Spartan king Archidamus predicted. It's very important to be modest about the kinds of conclusions political scientists like me can draw. They are usually, at best, statements of probability. Now, Thucydides is even more modest. Thucydides introduces you to perennial questions and problems, but he almost never gives you prescriptions. And that's because he's aware of underlying causes, like Sparta's fear of the rise of Athens, which push things in a general direction. But he's also aware that war is the realm of contingency, meaning that Thucydides, whom I basically see as one of the first political scientists, the founder of what's sometimes called the realist school, placing a high premium on balances of powers, that the best you can get from Thucydides is probabilities if you're thinking really hard. And I'll give you an example. The Athenians at Melos, and this is a great way to conclude, say to the Melians, you know as well as we do that justice, understood as following treaties, only exists amongst powers with an equal power to destroy each other. Otherwise, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Now, most people just quote the second part, strong do what they can, weak suffer what they must, but you should think about the first part. If you don't want the strong doing unto you what you don't want done unto you, you better be strong yourself. You better be at least equal in power. But here's the problem. What one country does to provide for its own security frequently makes another country insecure. And that leads to a reaction that can lead to the kind of polarized alliance system you see here, that can lead to arms races, that can lead to escalation. Meaning that while you can say there's a high probability, or good probability, if you have relative equality in power, that you will get something like peace. There's also a good chance that it will escalate out of control. And that, if you thought about it, has a lot to do with American policy and strategy relative to Ukraine and Russia, trying to control escalation but preserve a balance. And it also has a lot to do with American policy and strategy relative to Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, and its proxies, trying to control escalation. Probability then, you need some kind of balance, but beware in your effort to establish balance, you may fuel escalation. I wish I had a formula that I could quantify. to solve that problem, but it's contingent. All right, with that, by the way, Mrs. Burns, Mr. Flamenhoff, it's wonderful to see both of you again, but I can't be late for my next lecture because nobody's paying me for this one, and they're paying for that one.